Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on integrating cover crops. I'm Ellen Crane, the Extension Coordinator for the BCRC, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. This session will last approximately 1 hour, but may go longer depending on the number of questions you've got for us later during the question and answer period. If you're on Twitter, tweet along with us using the hashtag BeefWebinar. We are recording this session, and I will email out the link of the recording to everyone that registered in a couple of days. So if you miss hearing anything tonight and want to watch it again later, you can. Of course, you'll be able to hear and see tonight's presenters, but we can't hear or see you. If you want to communicate with us, type into the small chat window at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question or comment for me or the presenter, that's the place to do so. And feel free to send in questions at any time. We'll answer all of our questions at the end of the hour. If your internet connection is a bit slow tonight, it might help to close other programs that are using the internet, as well as close your webcam window, which means you won't be able to see us, but hopefully you'll be able to hear the audio and get the slides more clearly to load a bit faster for you. Okay, let's get started. This is what we will be covering tonight. You're going to hear from one speaker on the webinar talking about integrating cover crops into forage operation, risks and rewards. But first, I'd like to just take a moment of your time to talk about some updates that we've had to the BCRC blog. So if you are not familiar with our blog subscription, you can find it on our homepage. You can find it right here. It'll be in the orange box. So when you click on the subscribe button, it'll take you to this page here. So if you currently subscribe to our blog, you'll need to update your mailing list to receive our new monthly e-newsletter called The Wire. So to do that, you'll insert your email address, your province, select which sector that you belong to, and select the notifications you would like to receive. So currently, you would be subscribed to As It Happens, and you can also click subscribe to New Blog Post Monthly to get a monthly summary, or you can select monthly e-newsletter to receive a collection of information once a month right to your inbox. So once you've filled all of that information out, you click on your subscribe button, and you are up to date. If you have any questions on that, feel free to send those along or send me an email that has to do that. Now I'll turn it over to the expert of the hour, Jillian Bainard. I'm pleased to welcome Jillian. She is a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Swift Current Research and Development Centre. As a forage ecophysiologist, Jillian's research involves studying forage crops and the interface between plants and their environment. She works with forage breeders, ecologists, and animal scientists to develop forages that are beneficial nutritionally, environmentally, and economically. Jillian completed her Ph.D. in botany at the University of Guelph in 2011, followed by a postdoc at the SCRDC, where she studied the use of annual forage polycultures. Tonight, Jillian will be speaking about integrating cover crops into forage operations, the risks and rewards. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Jillian.
Thanks so much, Ellen, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. So I'm just going to get my presentation loaded up here. Great. So yes, as Ellen said, we're going to be talking about cover crops. And I'm a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, as Ellen said, here in Swift Current, the Research and Development Centre here. So I want to start by actually saying all my thank yous and acknowledging my collaborators up front, because I know towards the end of the presentation, it's not as interesting. So first of all, I really want to thank BCRC for inviting me to give this webinar. I'm currently part of their BCRC Researcher Mentorship Program, which has been a great opportunity. I'm a newer scientist. I started in my role in 2017. So it's been really important for me to get involved with industry and with producers. So this has been a really good opportunity. through the work I'm going to share with you tonight, I've had a lot of different collaborators, starting with Mike Schellenberg and Eric Lamb, so from Swift Current Research and Development Center, and from the U of S. Those were my postdoc supervisors, and that's some of the research I'm going to share tonight. Also, other Ag Canada researchers whose names will come up throughout my presentation are Luke Bainard and Alan Iwasa. And then Lei Ren was at the U of S, but now he's also with the Ministry of Agriculture here in Saskatchewan, and Dr. Bart Lardner is there at the U of S. And then some people from the Ministry of Agriculture have really helped out along the way, namely Trevor Lennox and Charlotte Ward. And then I have some funders there and people who have had input and again contributed to our research, namely the Manitoba Beef and Forage Initiative, the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture through their Agriculture Development Fund. So thank you to everyone. So let's get started. What I want to talk about tonight is listed here through this outline. So why are we talking about cover crops? I want to share what we're studying here, and then break it into 4 different aspects of cover crops: productivity, nutrition, weed control, and soil health. And then I'll kind of put it all together in some final thoughts. We're going to ask some poll questions as we go along here, so I hope you can partake in those. I look forward to hearing your opinion on some different things as well. So why are we studying cover crops? So part of the Canadian Beef Research and Technology Transfer Strategy for the newest round of sort of cluster funding starting in 2018 was to enhance industry sustainability and improve production efficiencies. So these include things like enhancing our feed and forage production, improving grazing management, getting better nutrition out of our crops, looking for different grazing strategies, and then economic and agronomic benefits of these different crops. So what we're wondering is, can cover crops help us achieve these goals? And so my first poll question for you today, if Ellen can put it up there, is I'm interested in knowing if you have tried to grow a cover crop for forage before. And what you've seen and what I've seen is that indeed it's really becoming a big part of what we encounter in social media and in popular press. So things like Canadian Cattlemen. Here's an article from last year. Here's another one from a few years ago in Country Guide, talking about the forage value of cover crops. Maybe these are your farms that I'm showing here on screen. Here's another one in the Western Producer, which is talking about polycropping. That's also from last year. And another one from Grain News. And if you Google something like this, you know, you're going to find a lot of it. And if you've talked to farmers in your area or across the country or down in the States, a lot of people are trying this. So we want to sort of understand from a research perspective what's happening and can we actually pinpoint some of these benefits that are being suggested. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, what are forage cover crops? When we talk about a cover crop, it's a crop that's grown typically for the benefit of the soil or for some purpose other than as a cash crop. So we're growing something that either gets plowed down, but we're looking for benefits usually to the soil or to the ecosystem. When we put that in a forage context, we're specifically looking at gaining those benefits in addition to a forage source for our cattle. So it can be a single crop. Most of the research that I'm going to be talking about looks at growing multiple crops together. So some of these benefits that I've mentioned are that this increased biodiversity, and this applies just in natural settings. That's where a lot of the sort of background for increasing biodiversity comes from. But then we put this in an agricultural setting, we see that this increased biodiversity is supposed to improve the sustainability of agroecosystems in several different ways. So we hope to see increased productivity, we hope to see increased forage nutrition, and perhaps increased soil health. I have that in quotes because as probably most of us have encountered, soil health is a pretty broad term that we don't always have a great definition for. And I'd like to say from a research perspective, we're actively working to make that definition something a little more attainable. But soil health can include things like soil fertility, nutrition, tilth or aggregation, ability for water penetration, and infiltration, etc. And then with these things, we also hope to see a reduction in our use of inputs, in particular things like pesticides and herbicides, if we can help suppress some of the weed communities or harmful insects as well. So also known as, I have at the bottom there, as you even saw in some of those article titles, things like polycropping, polycultures, cocktail mixtures, all of those terms kind of broadly fit under this umbrella of growing multiple crops together in the same time and at the same place. So let's do our second poll question here then. I want to know, how interested are you in growing cover crops for forage? So whether you have or have not, but how interested would you be based on this sort of broad definition I've given you there?
Okay, so we'll just pause you for a second, Jillian.
Thank you.
Results of our previous poll. Have you tried growing a cover crop for forage before? It's about 50-50. 51% said yes and 49% said no. So we'll go to...
Great.
Sorry, not that one. Question 2, sorry. There we go.
Right, so maybe for the 49% of you who haven't grown one, let us know how interested you might be in trying this. So while you're doing that, I'm going to start talking about what we're studying here, or some of the research that I've been directly involved in. So some of the projects at SCRDC include that one I mentioned with Mike Schellenberg and Eric Lamb. That's the one I started as a postdoc working on. It was a broad project looking at from monocultures up to 12 species in mixture. There was a winter polyculture project that Mike Schellenberg and Carrie LaForge put in. We developed another project on crop spacing, cover crop spacing for weed control, which I'll talk about a little bit tonight. Luke Bainard received funding from MBFI to study soil microbial ecology. So we're trying to get a better handle on what's happening below ground. And then Bart Lardner and Alan Iwasa have ADF funding for a swath grazing study using forage polycrops. So these are some of the projects that I'll kind of be highlighting throughout. And I should note, there's also a considerable amount of cover crop research being done by Miriam Fernandez here in the organic sector, which I won't be specifically talking about this evening, but just to know there's more work going on there as well. So currently, we have funding from Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association to look at management practices for forage cover crops. So that one we're looking at fertility management, so fertilizer application rates, as well as residues. So in terms of how much residue we should leave behind, whether we're grazing or taking a crop off, like how does that impact these suggested benefits. The second one is a sort of an addition to that soil microbial ecology one, where we're continuing on the project that was started earlier through MBFI. So that has a research site here in Swift Current, and also at the Brookdale Research Farm, which is near Brandon, Manitoba. And then I put pending here. I've got my fingers crossed on this one. I'm really hopeful. We do have confirmed funding from BCRC and from Manitoba beef producers in collaboration with MBFI to do a integrated crop livestock trial where we actually graze these cover crops in an annual cropping rotation. The only holdup is we're waiting for support from the government, so I should be finding out any day. I was hoping it would be today, but no such luck. So we'll keep you posted on that one. So in case anyone's joining from somewhere other than the prairie provinces. Just a reminder of where Saskatchewan is in Canada. There it's the province in red. And then Swift Current, where I'm based, is located in the southwestern corner. We are in the brown soil zone, and it's also considered to be a semi-arid area. So we are relatively dry, with hot summers, cold winters, and precipitation would be very seasonal. And the last few years, we would be considering some very semi-arid conditions, I think most people would say locally. So to give you an idea of the scope I'm looking at, this is the first cover crop trial I seeded, and this shows what it looks like. So the research farm here in Swift Current, it is plot-based research. So we do things on smaller scales where we can easily access the plots, replicate them. So each kind of row that you see here sort of running away from us, those are replicates, so that we can gain some statistical significance. So here's what our trial looks like, you know, in June, shortly after seeding. Here it is in July, kind of at peak productivity, and then in August, right before we harvested it. So I do like to show this just to kind of give you some context about how we do this data collection. And I think this is really important at these early stages to try to sort of figure out what direction we want to go in next. So we can say, what trends, what patterns are we seeing in this small scale? And then let's try and tease that apart, pick the best options, and sort of upscale it to maybe more field level surveys. Okay, so Ellen, do we have the results on that second question?
We do. So 79% are very interested, 20% are somewhat interested, and someone's indifferent. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's good. I would guess that most of you would be interested for signing in here tonight, so that's good to hear. So that leads us into the section on productivity, and maybe we could put up the third question now, because as I'm going along here, I guess I want you to think about how you could see this working on your farm if you aren't already trying it. And so this poll question is kind of trying to get at if you would be looking at integrating something like a cover crop into your own operation using your own land and your own livestock, or if this is more of an option you would be looking to collaborate with another farmer. So for example, an annual cropper working with a cattle farmer, where you can trade off the resources. So you can get some forage from the other farmer and they can get some, you know, manure and urea addition to their land. So that's what that poll question is about. So let's start talking about some of the results we've seen in the research I've done so far. So I want to start by looking at productivity. So we're going to jump into some data. Don't be overwhelmed by any of the figures. I've tried to make them really straightforward, and I'll explain them as we go here. So in terms of productivity, let's highlight some of the rewards to start with. So mixtures can improve biomass production, and I put there compared to some monocultures. If you look at those little graphs there, the dots up, if you can see my mouse there, the dots that are what we kind of call outliers, that means they're really highly productive. And those in this case were actually corn and oats. So you might get better biomass productivity off of them, but if you go down to the bottom here, so we're sort of at monoculture, that's what all the first row of dots mean. So crops grown alone. You can see there's some that did actually really poorly. So when we average that out and look at the trend, which is that line running across, we see that there's definitely a positive trend. And in the first graph here, it's the more species we include, we tended to see higher productivity. Now this is with the study that we included all the way up to 12 species. And I'll talk a little more about that. So don't think that that line is just going to keep on going if you keep adding more and more species. That's not necessarily the case. And like I said, you can see there are lots of monocultures, and in the binary mixtures, there's ones that are well above that line. So that line just represents a trend. But you can see we do see a little more stable biomass production perhaps as we go forward. The functional group richness on the other side of the screen here is highlighting the fact that in our mixtures we had 4 functional groups represented. So we had cool season grasses, warm season grasses, legumes, and brassicas. And the idea here is that each of those types of crops brings something different to the table, right? So we could say maybe for forage, or maybe for fixing nitrogen, maybe for weed control. And what you can see there, again, is that nice positive trend that we can say, yeah, as we are increasing that functional group richness, so richness just means how many groups you include, that line is going up. So that was sort of our first hint that we were seeing some actual positive rewards. In the new trial that I initiated last year with funding from Sask Cattlemen's Association, I wanted to sort of take that away from that really complex, like lots of different mixtures, and say, what if we kind of pick mixtures for certain purposes? So this trial, as I mentioned, just to remind you, it has to do with fertilizer rates and residue rates. So here are the 3 mixes I made and chose for these 3 reasons. One I called a balanced mix. So it had kind of an equal proportion of grasses to legumes to brassicas, and it's just 6 species. The weed control mix had a higher proportion of brassica species mixed in, and I'll talk more about that in a bit too. And then the nitrogen fixing mix was just legumes to see if we could really bulk up that sort of soil nitrogen content. So right now I'm still focusing on productivity though. And what you can see in this bar graph is this is measured in biomass production. So the first set of bars there is that balanced mix with the 6 species with 2 from sort of grasses, legumes, and brassicas. The next set of bars is that weed control mix, followed by the legume mix, and then there's a wheat crop there for comparison. So in that case, we're not looking at it for a forage comparison, but just a sort of an annual cropping comparison. And what you can see there is the mixtures did pretty well. So the balanced mix and the weed control mix are not really significantly different. That legume mix did lag behind a little bit. What you'll also see, and that's just also by nature of the type of plants they are, right? Like, you know, they don't have a huge amount of biomass. So you can see they still produce pretty well. Another thing to note is there isn't a real trend that we can pick out yet with the fertilizer rates. So we picked a no fertilizer, 60 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, and then 120 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen. So really like none, and a really high amount. So you can see the bars are different, but not really significantly so. What's interesting is when we look at that was from July, when we look at August, we see some shifts and some things don't shift. So the productivity or the biomass that we got from that balanced mix actually kind of maintains itself later into the season, and we don't really see a decrease in biomass. However, we see quite a sharp drop in biomass in that weed control mix because brassicas have so much water in them. So at this point they're drying up and they don't have that same sort of bulk and biomass that we might have seen earlier. This is all based on dry weight, I should say, but they're kind of losing some of that productivity. And then the legumes have actually increased from where they were in July, probably also as we see pod weight and seed weight being put on there. I just want to think if there's anything else I want to highlight there. I think let's move on to some risks related to cover crop production. As with any crop, we see a lot of variability due to weather or climate. So this example here is from a trial that I grew in 2015 and 2016. 2015, if you look at that little chart on the right there, the 2015 is the dotted line here. If you remember, it was one of the driest springs on record, and particularly here in Swift Current, it was extremely dry. And 2016 had one of our wettest springs on record. And so that's clearly going to be evidenced in that biomass production. So you can see we had almost double the production in 2016 compared to 2015. Looking at that 2015 crop, though, it didn't look terribly poor or depleted. So that was a 4-species mix there in the picture. We can also see variability due to local site differences. So the information on this slide was shared with me from Charlotte Ward with Saskatchewan Agriculture. And a few summers back, she spent a lot of time collecting some case studies from producers around the province, and particularly in the area where she works. And so I found this example extremely interesting. So this is a producer near Craven, and they grew a mixture of peas, oats, and brassicas in their cover crop. This was seeded into land that previously had alfalfa and brome grass, and so you can see some of that is still showing up. The blue color in those bar graphs is actually alfalfa. And what I want to highlight is just the big change in species, proportion, and productivity depending where you were in their field. So the upland is just referring to like a hilltop, and the lowland would be at the bottom of the hill. And you can see in both the pictures and in the graph how different those look. So there can be quite a bit of variability, and I think in some cases this would be more pronounced in a cover crop than in a different monoculture that's, you know, been tested and selected for growth under a range of conditions. With these cover crops, we're not necessarily seeing that, so I would consider that a bit of a risk. However, back to a reward, even in these stressful conditions, I think we also still see benefits, and this is a really good example. This is in the 3rd year of a cover crop trial, that one that was funded by ADF. And on the left side of your screen is an 8-species mix with oats, and on the right is just an oats monoculture. And I think you can see the oats in the mixture are above sort of the line of the horizon there. You can see them in the sky, so to speak. And this site was extremely nutrient deprived at this point, and productivity was very low. However, in that mixture, we can see there's something there that's helping it grow better. And this was in a completely zero input situation, so we didn't fertilize or do anything like that. So probably due to the legumes in the mix, maybe some of the brassicas bringing nutrients up, we did see some better nutrient availability than in the monoculture alone. So in regards to more risks, actually let me back up a minute here. Ellen, do you want to share the last results on the poll since I'm getting ready for the next one?
Sure. So 68% said no, I would rather use my own land and cattle resources. For would you like to partner with another producer to utilize cover crops for feed?
Okay, great. So that's very interesting. And yeah, I hope both ways can be feasible for whichever way you're looking for on your own farm. So thank you for your reply. So for the next poll question, I'm going to talk about this and then I'll get Ellen to put it up there. One of the risks we found with productivity is that some of the crops that are being sold or sometimes recommended by seed companies as being a good cover crop or a good forage crop are not necessarily suitable for where you actually live. So for Swift Current at our site, that one of those crops was kale, which is I've shown there, and you can see the crop. This was in July. It's very small, and the nice green carpet behind it is all portulaca. Now I know that is probably a little more related to our sort of plot-based research, but the kale really did poorly. And similarly, other crops, in talking to producers, you know, they've tried and they don't grow. So that's a risk in my mind that we would need to be aware of. And also, there's a big challenge of seeding crops with different seed sizes and seeding depths, and not everyone has the equipment kind of prepared for that. And the seeding rates you put in are not necessarily what come up. So you can think, oh, I'm going to make a really nice mix here with this many, hopefully this representation of peas, for example, and I want this many oats. But when you seed it and plant it, that's not necessarily what's going to come up. So that's where my next poll question comes in. I'm wondering if you have, I guess, put in a cover crop, or if you're thinking about it, do you like those ready-made mixes that seed companies sell? Is that the sort of easiest and least stressful route? Or would you rather try and make your own mix and hopefully work with a seed rep who can say, okay, here's some different things we know work in your area? Or are you completely making your mix on your own, where you're saying, I've tried this, I know this works, or I talked to my neighbor, I'm going to go buy these things separately and put my mix together myself? So that's the next question for you there. And you can see in the picture, I mean, just intuitively, right? Peas are much bigger seeded, they should be seeded deeper. But things like millet, that's what the little yellow seeded one there, it's very small and needs to be closer to the surface. And then the third one there, the reddish colored seed, is radish, which is sort of an intermediate seeding depth. So depending on the type of equipment you have, and if you can sideband or select different depths with different sort of boxes or tanks on your seeder, that's great. For the research seeder I have, that's not very adaptable, and so we've really encountered some variability there. Okay, so let's move on to nutrition. So let's look at some rewards and some risks here as well. So what we found with regards to forage nutrition is that depending on what you include in your mix, you can definitely improve on the nutritive quality compared to a monoculture, or you can at least maintain it. So you can pick things that you know are going to give you the type of nutritional characteristic you're looking for to build a better forage source. So for example, this is the MBFI trial that was grown in Swift Current and in Brookdale, or at the Brookdale farm. And the results were similar for both sites. So this has a monoculture of oats, that's the white bar. It's just the one species. And then there was a 3, a 6, and a 9 species mix. And what you can see is that the 3 mixtures compared to that monoculture all had higher protein or crude protein levels, and they all had lower neutral detergent fiber, or NDF. And so both of those things, we want to have higher protein and lower fibers, are typically what we look for in a high quality forage. So I'd say that is a really big reward that we can gain from those mixtures. This is another way of looking at it. Also, some of the micronutrients we find in the mixtures, depending on what species are included. So this is just sort of generally in that same study, but saying comparing the mixtures to the monoculture. And so the blue arrows are all for increases, and the size of the arrow and kind of the color of the arrow shows how much of an increase or difference there was, compared to the red arrows are for decreases. So we see increases in things like calcium, copper, iron, nitrogen, that's just the TKN is for the type of nitrogen we looked at. And then phosphorus and potassium also go up. With that said, obviously you don't want super high levels of some of these either, so there has to be sort of a careful, you should be doing feed testing to make sure these things are in the right balance and that you're supplementing if necessary. And then as noted, the ADF, so the acid detergent fiber, and the NDF, neutral detergent fiber, both went down with the mixtures, which is also a benefit. Based on some of the work we've done looking at some of those individual species, just to highlight 2 that kind of stood out, brassicas, such as turnip, they have particularly low ADF and NDF. They're very highly digestible. They have high crude protein, and they have high calcium, iron, and phosphorus. Now, all of those things together doesn't really mean that you should just go and graze a bunch of turnips, and I'll show you why in the next slide. But also to recognize, obviously, we don't want things that are super digestible, because that's not very helpful for the cattle either, right? We want something that they can digest well, but not too quickly. Something like hairy vetch actually had one of the highest crude protein contents that we measured, and it's also highly digestible. And then the note at the bottom there is just to highlight that in the study where I had monocultures, 2, 4, 8, and 12 species mixtures, we didn't really see any improvements when we increased more species past that 4 level. So at that point, you know, you're probably not going to get that much more benefit nutritionally. So it's finding the right balance in those species. So as I alluded to, risks, and this is work that Alan Iwasa and Bart Lardner were doing, and this figure came from Alan here at Swift Current Research and Development Center. The red line is the safe level for nitrates, and the blue line is the safe level for sulfates. And the first 8, sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These ones are all different brassicas, and then this is a clover here and a grass. And you can see the majority of the brassicas have nitrate levels that would be considered toxic, and several of them have sulfur levels that would be too high. So this is a case where you would not want to be grazing these in monoculture. And another consideration about that risk is that those brassicas tend to be the ones that sort of stick around the best. So they end up being the highest proportion of palatable forage late in the season. So for example, they grow better after being grazed. A lot of them have significant regrowth, and a lot of them are frost tolerant. So in one way, this is great. Like you can see in the picture there with the snow, you know, oh, there's still some green forage there. But if that's the only thing that's really available for the cattle, that would be a risk. So moving on to weed control. So this is something I've been really interested in, and I think we're finding some neat results. So here's another one of those sort of dots, again, looking at a trend from mixtures with 1, 2, 4, 8, or 12 species. And now we see this downward trend where we see that those mixtures seem to have a better ability to control weeds than monocultures. And again, not all monocultures. You'll see there are several dots here that are below that trend line or below that average. But again, that trend is going downward. We took the results from this study and tried to look at sort of why is this happening. We wanted to know, was it species selection that was important, or also possibly how you seeded it. So we actually tried different row spacing. So having the crops, you know, about 1 foot apart versus about 1/2 foot apart, or 30 centimeters and 15 centimeters. And what we found is that the row spacing really didn't have an impact on a weed abundance, but the species selection really did. And I kind of highlighted some of the mixes here on this scale. Oats and peas had the poorest weed control, and barley and radish had the highest weed control. And this highlights some of the species I've listed there. Things like forage radish, turnip, barley, and triticale show really strong weed suppression capabilities. And this is probably for 2 reasons. One, just based on their competitive ability, the brassicas in particular put out a big amount of leaves and biomass, so they're really shading out the lower canopy or the soil level with their broad canopy. And you know, they take over a good amount of area, and they're very competitive. The other thing these crops all have is the potential for allelopathy, which is the ability to release chemicals that kind of suppress other plants around them. So we're probably seeing a mixture of both. We also took this same idea with the barley and radish and tested it in the greenhouse, and also found that it's that mixture that works really well at suppressing weeds in combination. Okay, Ellen, what were the results on that poll question?
Okay, so for the seed company's question, 66% said I would like to work closely with a seed rep to make a mix that works on my farm. This was followed by 24%. I would like to make my own mix independently, and 9% said they'd rather buy some mix ready-made. Okay,
great, thank you. And yeah, I think that's kind of what I've encountered in talking to producers too. You're going to get a range of of comfort and knowledge based around what you already know that gives you that availability. So I want to put up the next poll question then. And sort of this relates to what I've been talking about all along, and now kind of highlighting this, some of the results with the weed control, and what I was talking about with nutrition is how many or what kind of cover crop appeals to you. So do you want to try just growing everything? I've talked to producers who grow things because they like it. You know, they say, I want sunflowers in there because I think they're beautiful, or I want this flowering plant because I'm hoping will attract more pollinators. Or some people are they just want to try everything. Other people just want sort of a moderate level of complexity. Some people want to keep it pretty basic. So I'm calling that a simple mix, 2 to 4 crops. Or do you just want to try a single crop, just a single monoculture that you can put in there, try and get some benefits from, get some forage out of it, but nothing too complicated. So I look forward to seeing your results there. Why I brought that up here is going back to this trial that I'm doing right now with Sask Cattlemen's, looking at those sort of the what I call a balanced mix with 6 species, the weed control mix, and then the simpler mix, but that's just focused on sort of nitrogen fixing. When we link this back to weed control, you can see that what I was calling a weed control mix did really well. So that's the bars second from the left there. But they didn't actually do that much better than that balanced mix. And both of those did considerably better than that legume mix on its own, and also much better than the wheat monoculture. What also is interesting here is you'll see in the dark colored bars, that's the highest rate of fertilizer application. So even though we weren't really seeing that fertilizer effect when it came to productivity and biomass, we really can see it here with weed control. So I think that's interesting that it was providing some competitive edge or ability for those cover crops to kind of suppress the weeds more. So that would be sort of another reward to highlight. What are the risks with weed control? Well, weeds can get out of control in a cover crop, and especially if that cover crop performs poorly. So in the picture there, this is one of my really low productive, like super stressed sites, and you can see between the crop rows there's a lot of weeds. And I think in other, especially when we had those really dry years, if you didn't hit the seeding time right and get some biomass production, it might have been a bit of a wreck where there would have been a lot of weeds that would have been able to come in there. And of course, if you have this really diverse set of species with broadleafs and grasses, your ability to select a herbicide or other form of control is going to be really difficult. That can be a problem. And then the third point I have here for a risk related to weed control is that there are some reports of some of the cover crops actually becoming weedy. For example, hairy vetch. We kind of grow it considering it as an annual, but it's probably more of a biennial. If it does go to seed, it can come back as well. So some of that will be management based on when you're grazing or when you're harvesting to make sure things aren't going to seed more than necessary. Along with that, some people like it when hairy vetch comes back because it's a very low growing, relatively fine plant, and it's a legume, right? So if it fixes nitrogen, maybe it will be beneficial, but it's something to be aware of. Okay, moving on to soil health here. So I put rewards question mark because this is a little bit of a trickier area where I'd say things are still pretty gray. Some of you watching right now may be saying, well, that's crazy because I know on my farm I can find areas where the soil is way better or it's improved. I can see difference in the color, the quality, the texture. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. What I am saying is that soil properties take a really long time to change in general. And so when we're looking at it from a research perspective and trying to get hard numbers on that soil nutrition, it's been very hard to tease apart at this point. So in the first few years that we've been running these trials, we haven't really found very many significant effects. I'm going to highlight here the MBFI study. And so again, with those arrows sort of showing, we see a slight increase in nitrate and sulfates, but it was not very much. And we didn't really see any changes in the soil chemical properties in that larger ADF trial that I've talked about before. Now, the trial we just initiated last year, we actually don't have those results back from the lab because it takes us a while to get those. Also to note that Manitoba trial was grazed. So MBFI put their herd on this trial and grazed it. And we were kind of hoping we would see a change, obviously, in the soil chemical components based on that addition of manure and urea and the hoof action, sort of trampling things. But at this point, after that first season, we didn't see any effects of grazing. Another question mark is changes in that living component of the soil. And this is work that Luke Bainard is doing. So yes, he is my husband. Yes, we work together. He also works here in Swift Current, and he's a soil microbial ecologist. So what he can bring to the table is a way to actually sort of look at this community in a more detail than we've probably done before. And what we find with the mixtures, so this is compared to the oats monoculture, we don't really see any significant shift in the bacteria diversity or composition. We do see a shift in the fungal community composition. So what that means, it's not better or worse, but it's different under the mixtures than it is under the monoculture. And we also saw at one site a slight increase in pathogenic fungi. And this is probably related to the crops that we're growing that could harbor these fungi. The grazing part of this, we actually saw that grazing lowered the amount of bacterial diversity at the site and increased the fungal diversity. Now, just a side note to kind of, I guess, caution against reading too much into this. Bacterial communities change super rapidly. So if the moisture changes, if the temperature changes, if pH changes, they're going to fluctuate quite quickly. They're very responsive. Fungal communities we find are a little more stable and change more slowly. And so in some ways they could be considered a slightly better indicator of an actual change to that community. So that's where we'll be keeping an eye on this change in fungal diversity under grazing, for example, and seeing how that how that plays out and what that effect means. Another reward, we've found some slight evidence for increases in soil stable aggregates. So this is just kind of the ability of your soil to stick together. So I pulled this picture off the internet showing the idea of aggregation. So the sample on the left, you can see it's added at the top. The sample at the right gets added in the second picture, and you can see it's right away disintegrating. So that would be an example of poor, wet, stable aggregates. So you can link this back to things like erosion and sort of poor ability to retain moisture. And it's actually usually linked to organic content. So if we see better aggregation, we see higher soil organic content. So in that big ADF trial we did, over time, over the whole study, we did see an increase in soil stable aggregates. And the most significant or considerable increases in that aggregate stability were in the mixtures as compared to the monocultures. So this is something where we definitely need more research going forward. Some risks with soil fertility. As I said, we're not too sure of the rewards, but the one risk I would highlight is that in a very zero input situation, the mixtures weren't really likely to maintain fertility. So again, here's a very nutrient deprived plot. You can see things are looking chlorotic, they're looking stressed. And this is after 3 years with no inputs, so that's maybe not surprising to you, but just to show that you're going to need to manage that nutrition, and that's why we're continuing some of those studies to understand more about can you dial it back a bit? Can you use lower fertilizer rates? And I would remind you of that oat example I showed earlier, where the oats were doing much better in the mixture than they were in monoculture. So what's next? So that kind of brings you up to speed on a lot of the research I've been doing. As I've alluded to the Cattlemen's Association trial, we do also have residue management, where we're looking at what happens when you completely remove the biomass from the plot compared to when you leave some of it, or if you leave all of it. So all of it would be like a true cover crop where you wouldn't be grazing it or using it for forage. So we're putting those in there to try and, again, tease apart what might be a good level of grazing. So that's something we're looking into. I already put a little plug in for this new project we're hoping to get, but really looking at the integrated crop and livestock system. And maybe this is a good time for that last poll question there, Ellen.
Okay, so for the previous question, if you were going to seed a forage crop, what kind of cover crop appeals most to you? There was a bit of a tie here. 43% a mix with moderate level of complexities, 5 to 8 crops, and 43% said a simple mix, 2 to 4 crops, and then it goes from there.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's interesting and informative for me too, to sort of know where to focus our research. Not that we'll pick one over the other, but of course, always enjoy hearing your experience as well. So the last question I want to ask is how you want to consider utilizing a forage cover crop. So do you want to direct graze and bring your animals right onto your land and get these benefits that we hear about, right? Like the manure, the hoof action. Or are you considering some kind of stockpiled grazing where you're trying to get forage biomass and save it for later? So whether you're swath grazing or doing another form of trying to extend that grazing season into the fall. And then the third one is, are you looking for a way to just take this right off the land? You don't want cattle out there. Maybe you don't have cattle, but you want to sell this feed to someone else and they don't want to bring their cattle to your land, for example. Would you want to remove it completely? And these are some of the questions we want to get at through that residue question I just talked about. And then, as I said, to highlight this new study we're really hoping is going to go through. We have strong industry support from BCRC, MBP, and MBFI. I am collaborating with 2 producers. I'm super excited about this. These are collaborations I acquired through my mentorship program with BCRC. So Summer Green Forages with Sarah Sommerfeld and 2T Ranch with Dwayne Thompson. So that's awesome to bring producers. And in this project, we really want to get more large scale. So not those little small plots, but what might be a bigger plot that gives us a better idea of what's happening. And then we're partnering with some really great people. The economic analysis, you might have noticed that's missing in the work I've been sharing today, because that's something we really need to move forward on. And then better soil physical characterization, better soil microbial characterization, and then really understanding more about this grazing management. So that's something I'm excited about. Okay, let's see those poll results.
So 48% said direct grazing, followed by 29% stockpile grazing, and 24% bale and remove. Okay,
nice. So nice split there again as well. So that's very interesting. Thanks. Okay, so what are my final thoughts here, wrapping up? I hope I've highlighted a lot of the rewards to using forage cover crops, but also just sort of made you aware of some of the risks. And really, it requires careful planning and management, as I know all of the producers out there already do. And working with people, I guess I would encourage, again, talking to people who have tried crops in your area to learn if they actually grow, and talk with your seed reps and different people who are there as resources. And in particular, your provincial ministry reps have a lot of knowledge in this area. And of course, I don't mind fielding questions, as do other researchers, both in government and in academia. So make sure to look us up. So don't forget, the species selection is going to be probably one of your most important things. And just say, a lot of people also will ask me, oh, well, what should I grow? Well, that's always my biggest sort of warning, is it's really locally dependent. So spend some time trying to figure that out. And then pick those species based on what you want them to do. So I think I've showed how brassicas for example, can be really good at weed control, and they're pretty nutritious, but they can also be pretty toxic. So keeping all those things in balance. Seeding rate and seeding date is important. I didn't really go into this a lot, but to note again that to work with these mixes, trying to figure out when things are going to grow based on your conditions and how much productivity you're going to get, to keep those things in mind. And then, as I already mentioned, take some caution when you're grazing those brassicas to make sure you're supplementing appropriately. So with that, I guess I just want to say thank you. Thanks again to BCRC and especially to Ellen for moderating tonight. And thank you all for sharing with me. There's my email address if you'd like to get in contact with me. So thank you. And now I think we can take some questions.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, type those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I believe we have some to start here already. So the first question, do you have any experience or knowledge about comfrey production? And if so, would you recommend subclover as a suitable ground cover crop for comfrey?
Okay, so the question is about use of comfrey?
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that's one crop I don't have any experience with. So I cannot help you with that one, sorry.
No worries, okay. What chemicals can be used as a pre-seed burn-off without having effects on the crop? And in this case, they had lots of clovers in our crop last year when they tried this. If you have any recommendations.
Oh, this is also a little bit out of my league. Oh, come on, guys, you're asking me the hard questions. I don't have a lot of experience with that, again, just to be honest. I think the biggest thing is, of course, timing if you're doing pre-seed herbicide application. With some of our research trials, we have used glyphosate prior to seeding just to get the site cleared off. And we haven't had any issues with like impacting the subsequent growth as long as we've allowed that appropriate window, because of course we are talking about annual crops. So I can't really weigh in more than that, as much as to say pay close attention to the timeline on it.
Oh, that's great. We have lots of other questions here. Is there any risk of toxicity and anti-nutritional factors in cover crops?
So I guess I'm wondering, is the person asking toxicity different than what I've mentioned in brassicas? So just sort of cover crops in general. Is there any other specification?
There's no specification. So I guess in general is the question.
I guess my answer here would be always feed test. So take a sample in before you're going to graze it or before you're going to feed it to your cattle to figure out if there are any issues with toxicity. I don't know specifically, except again, to stay away from those monocultures that might present some of those risks, like the brassicas. And so focusing on a balanced mix with things that you're comfortable with, you know, things like oats and barley, keep that in there, I think is sort of a safer route to go. But in terms of sort of a broad scale toxicity sort of rating, I can't help there, sorry.
That's okay. Can you comment about water retention? How cover crops assist with that? That's one of the questions.
Right, so great questions. All of these are great questions. So in terms of water retention, so I can talk a little bit about what we expect to see. There is a hope that including things like brassicas, because of their large rooting structure, that you'll kind of increase channels for infiltration and hopefully increase the water that's going down into the soil as opposed to off the surface. That's one aspect of it. I will say I have tried some infiltration studies and they were not very successful. That's why I'm looking forward to collaborating with a soil scientist like Steve Crittenden. In terms of retention, depending on what you're growing, I think you're going to see that your water use is going to be pretty different. So I didn't show that data, but an example that I noticed when we compared to a perennial crop, which can require a lot of moisture or be taking up a lot of moisture actively because they have such a bigger amount of root biomass. I noticed that some of our 12 species mix actually had lower soil moisture compared to some of the more basic or simple mixes. And in some cases, it was actually similar to the water use of the perennial crop. I say this kind of as a caveat because it probably needs a little more careful look there. But I think depending on what you're growing, you could have something that uses a ton of water and you would actually deplete your water resources. And in other cases, it would be moderate or maybe just sort of typical. And then hopefully we can also increase that water source.
Great. Some small grain cereals are not suitable for growing in a cover crop as they can be difficult to control in a subsequent cereal crop, such as wheat. Do you have any advice on the small grain cereals to avoid in a cover crop mixture?
Oh, good question. This one is hard for me to answer because it would depend on what you're wanting going into the mixture. I know, for example, the brassicas, the radish, like I showed, is not a tiny seed, it's small seed, but some of the other ones, like kale and turnip, are actually very small. So those ones could be a little bit risky just in terms of size. And then things like millet have a very small seed. Vetch, like hairy vetch, is sort of moderate. It's actually a pretty variable seed size. So I guess, again, this would be something I would probably link back to management, that if you were able to spray something out prior to seeding back to a cereal crop, or try and harvest it and remove it before it actually shells out. That doesn't work as well in like a swath grazing scenario. But it's hard for me to specifically say, don't do it, because I'm not super familiar with the total regrowth potential of those seeds.
Okay. Seeding depths. Is there a best way to judge how deep something should be seeded? You mentioned that seeding different species require different depths. Is there one to kind of err on?
Right, so this is a tricky one because so what I would say is look at the supplier sort of recommended seeding depth. If you have a seeder that can only do one depth, what I've done in my research plots is pick something intermediate. So if some things should be really shallow seeded, like I'll use inches, like 1/4 inch, and some things like peas are more like 1.5 inch deep, or depending on where your soil moisture is, you may want to go even deeper. I've picked sort of an intermediate, like a 3/4 inch seeding depth. It's worked okay, but I think this is largely dependent on your seeding equipment. And if you're working in, for example, a tilled soil, or if you're totally zero tilled, depending what kind of openers you have on your seeder, and even packers, like, are you going to get good soil coverage? If you're including things like corn, like I've had some trials where I can just see the corn and peas sitting on top of the surface. Some grow, some do fine, but you're losing a huge amount based on what's not growing. So again, that's going to depend on what you put in your mix. And so I would say if you could side band it, so like use your fertilizer side bander to put your small seed stuff closer to the surface and your larger seeded deeper, that would probably be an ideal way to approach it. Or you consider doing multiple passes where you do all your large seeded stuff first and then come back and do your small seeded crops.
Okay, this one's kind of related to this. If you're lacking some seeding equipment, could you broadcast seed onto existing pasture land?
Oh, good question. I don't have a lot of direct experience with this. Because they're annuals and it's going to really depend on what kind of surface you're going into. So if it's like a very well-established perennial stand, I would be surprised if you got much productivity out of that, just because most of these annuals require a bit of soil surface coverage to really take root and grow. I guess I would say try and ask someone who's done it better than me. I could see it being a bit risky though. If you were going into like a tilled soil, you might get decent coverage if you just kind of broadcasted it and maybe, you know, harrowed it or something after to kind of get a little bit of light coverage. But I'm not sure about going directly into, say, an existing crop.
We've had a couple questions about what seems to be the best time for seeding. And this might depend on region as well.
Right. So I know I kind of alluded to that at the very end where I said seeding date's important. This is going to depend on where you're located, what kind of conditions you're experiencing, but also your grazing management strategy. So if you one of the first trials we did here, we actually seeded in June because we were trying to sort of offset those seasonal demands, figured out like trying to see what that would be like, and also push that productivity later in the season when you might be running short on other forages. In maybe an average moisture year, that would be actually great. In a dry year, you could be risking getting like almost no productivity if you did that. In south of the border in the Dakotas, I actually know they've also done some trials, and maybe people here locally, maybe someone can weigh in on that, have tried seeding even later, like into July or August after removing another crop. So for kind of a late season growth, in particular, some of those things, like if any of you have grown tillage radish, you know, you can grow it later in the season. It will send more roots down so you can get better soil breakup. That again is dependent on moisture availability and kind of what your site conditions are like. So I guess that's a really long answer, but I would say try and consider how and when you want to use that forage as kind of the most important factor for when you seed. And then of course the weather and your conditions.
Okay, I think we'll just take a couple more questions here. It's getting pretty late here on the East Coast. How long does it take to see significant changes in soil quality?
Right, so I know I kind of said it can take a long time. I don't have a good number in mind for that, and I think that's something we're hoping to keep tracking down in relation to these trials. Unfortunately, the nature of research funding, things happen sort of cyclically and don't always last a long time. But I would hope, so the study I did there was after 3 years, we weren't really seeing any appreciable results, or differences, I should say. They were still results. But I don't want to put a number on it, but I would say it could be more than 5 years. It could be longer than that, depending on what goes into it and how different those changes are that you make to your cropping production and to your land base.
Why didn't you include any clovers in any of your trials, or did you include any?
Great question. So in the first trial I had for my legumes, I had a forage pea, a field pea, and hairy vetch. Those were kind of selected based on, I think, both their forage quality and their ability to grow locally. In my newest trial, I have berseem clover, and unfortunately, what we find with a lot of the clovers, so I know red clover is a popular one, and then there's lots of other new ones, they grow actually pretty poorly in swift current. I know other producers have some really great success with them in other areas of the province, and in swift current, through a lot of the tests that Mike Schellenberg has done, we just find pretty poor productivity. So that's why they're missing from our mixtures.
Okay, and we just got a comment from someone that broadcast seeding works relatively well in a field where there's a lot of organic matter and loose topsoil. So someone speaking from experience, possibly.
Great, that's perfect. That's what we need to hear. So yeah, I guess, yeah, like you said, depending on the amount of organic material there, if the seed can kind of, you know, find a good seed bed there, that's great to hear.
Okay, my last question, and it kind of covers a couple that are left here. Any issues with making silage bales with brassicas is one of the questions.
Oh, this is a little bit out of my area of expertise as well, because I haven't really tested sort of that storage ability or in terms of using it for silage bales. Because they have such a high moisture content, you would really want to be aware of what that content is going in terms of how it might degrade or how it might change. So I can't give any specific advice there, as much as just to say there probably are some extra considerations that you should take into account when including those brassicas because of that high moisture content.
Great. I think we'll end everything there.
Wow.
Thank you for answering the questions, Jillian.
Well, thank you for so many questions. I feel like I probably didn't answer as many as everyone would like, but please feel free to email me and maybe we can get a dialogue going about some of these other aspects and maybe things I can look into down the road here. So thank you for all those questions.
Okay. Just a couple of things before we go. One is to get more information on science-based production and advice through the BCRC. Go to our website at beefresearch.ca and click on the subscribe button to sign up for our free email list. If you've got a Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube account, you can connect with us there. We won't be having a next webinar. This is the end of our series for 2018-2019. You'll receive an email from me in the next couple of days with a link to watch the recording, as well as links to some additional information on cover crops. You'll also receive a link to a survey. So if you take a few minutes of your time to fill out this survey, it's very helpful for us when preparing for future webinars. And that's it. Thanks to you at home for joining us tonight. And on behalf of everyone, thank you, Jillian, for volunteering your time and expertise. Good night.